Just in time for your weekly most comprehensive look at the world of business and economics. A warm and hearty welcome to another episode of Business Redefined. We are focusing on the subject of the recession based on the latest numbers released by the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. The accepted definition of a recession is that when an economy contracts in two consecutive terms, then by design, it is in recession. And we are privileged to have the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Kwame Owino. Always a delight to have you. Welcome on set. Thank you. Kwame, it didn't come to many of us as a surprise. If you followed the Q2 labor report last year, there was indication that we were hemorrhaging about 1 million jobs in just 3 months. We certainly did see this coming, rather, didn't we?
Yes, we did. I mean, obviously, I think 1.7 million jobs lost in one quarter is unprecedented in Kenya's history. I mean, so to lose 1.7 million jobs, that's the equivalent of jobs created every 2 years. So that was going to be definitely very deep. What was clear is that the second quarter was much, much better. I mean, the third quarter of the year was much, much better because of the restrictions and the public education and obviously the measures that were clear. It was clear that people had a handle of what the pandemic would do, and therefore people were more careful, in addition to other things, whether it's geographical or something else that favored us. So the mortality was not as bad, people were unwell, but we didn't run out of beds and stuff like that. So people started to go back to work when the curfews and everything, the restrictions came back down. So obviously a recovery was taking place.
But when I disaggregate the growth numbers for Q3 2020, my assessment is that it was actually a relatively strong performance, because if you disaggregate the numbers, you'll realize apart from the double-digit dip we saw in hospitality, agriculture is looking up, financial services are looking up. A number of sectors are actually showing green shoots. So maybe we shouldn't be too harsh in assessing that recession. We should look at the number in terms of the quality of the growth in the sectors which grew. Don't you think so?
Certainly. I mean, what it suggests, if you look at those numbers, you put those numbers together, what it suggests is that we're probably going to have, at the worst, a U-shaped, but probably the possibility of a V-shaped recovery, which is basically, I think the second quarter of last year, that is between March and June, was the bottom of the trough. So definitely we are coming out of it. How strongly that happens still depends on, I mean, we can only confirm once we have the numbers, but it's clear because it was a 5.7 dip, negative 5.7, and then obviously it was less than, it was about half of that in the next quarter. So it's clear that a recovery was taking place.
The question that emerges now, Kwame, is this. We're talking about a recession for the first time in decades, and we had a stimulus package, which was ideally meant to countervail this sort of outcome. What's your assessment of the stimulus package that we adopted as a country? You'll remember the first phase, we're talking about 47 billion shillings. The second phase, which is the 8-point economic recovery agenda, was about 53 billion shillings. I have my concerns about it. What are your thoughts?
Well, you could see the stimulus package in two ways. One of those was basically the tax cuts, which I think helped massively. In fact, I think the tax cuts helped much, much more than the petty amount. I mean, 47 billion shillings in a 10 trillion shillings economy is not nothing, but it's not going to cause much. I mean, even if you scale it according to tax collections, it's equivalent to about 7 or 8 days of tax collections on a strong year. So really, that's not much. But the tax cuts that were given to businesses, that Parliament approved and which was given to businesses and to private consumers, I mean, and to working people, I think was extremely helpful. So if you think of the combined effect of those two, that was a pretty good stimulus. In my view, actually confirms that the fiscal stimulus that was applied was too small, but it was helped massively by the fact that there was another stimulus coming from ease on the paycheck side. I'm not too sure that 100 billion in total over 6 months could create as much of a boost as these tax cuts certainly created. So I think it was more of the tax cuts part.
But now that raised the tax cuts, Kwame, the COVID-19 relief measures have already been reversed. Yes. And we seem to be back to the pre-COVID regime, despite the fact that clearly the economy is nursing a hangover, if I could call it, from the COVID shock. Do you think they were withdrawn prematurely?
Certainly withdrawn prematurely. Certainly withdrawn prematurely. In fact, in my view, those tax cuts gave the impression that, gave the opportunity for businesses to breathe. People because of the shocks to support many more, because in Kenya one wage supports many more people than in other places. So actually it was the multiplier in my view, as opposed to the physical spending part. It was withdrawn too early. I think in 6 months, just like its effects were, and not just withdrawn. This is the wicked part about government. It actually played a trick by bringing in even more taxes, just as recovery was taking place. So I think that growth might still happen in this first quarter of this year, but government would simply have cut its tail by bringing in new taxes much sooner.
The government, in its defense, will tell you that, look, clearly we had to create some more fiscal breathing space for ourselves. And you realize this because we went to IMF to tap into a credit facility, we went to the World Bank for the same, and they come with conditions. Yeah. That you need to ramp up your domestic revenue mobilization if you're to continue to have this safety net, if I could call it that. That's the reason they use. And don't you think it flies? Because look, we clearly have a fiscal problem in this country.
Well, I think we have a fiscal problem, but it's not a revenue problem. No, I don't think it is. In the sense that we at the Institute of Economic Affairs think that we have probably reached the limits of an efficient way of tweaking the tax rates, which is all government can do, to quote-unquote incite consumption behavior or employment behavior in a way that raises total tax take. I think the government of Kenya, for a country at this level of income, is probably getting as much taxes as it can from the population. Now, I'm not talking about, so if you're going to talk about efficiency in tax collection, there's space for that and something to be done, because if every 3 years we are going to have to give a tax amnesty, it's telling you that there's something about the collection system or how you raise your taxes and not necessarily the tax rates that's a problem. So that's that. So if the argument with the IMF specifically is about how to make collections better and how to be more efficient, that's fine. If it's about how to raise tax rates, I disagree completely, because the evidence is right before us. So if you already lost 1.7 million jobs in a quarter, it's unprecedented to create 1.7 million jobs in another quarter, even in a year. So that's not going to happen. So if you're raising tax rates rather, and expecting them to raise incomes, the welfare effect and the extra collections might not be worth. And my view is, again, talking about taxes, the fact that you have so many businesses, then an escalation of businesses resorting to courts and tribunals to resolve tax questions in itself tells you that there's something about tax administration. And the push that Parliament and the executive is giving to the KRA is leading to more, is leading to more and more acrimonious forms of tax collection. They should watch that. Yeah.
Right, and that point by Kwame Owino takes us to a short break. Business Redefined will be back with a lot more on this discussion on Kenya's economic status. Welcome back to Business Redefined, your weekly, most comprehensive look at the world of business and economics. We are discussing the state of the economy, the recession, the way out of it. And now in the part 2 of our conversation with the Chief Executive Officer, Kwame Owino at IEM, let's talk about the economic recovery strategy. Yes. In November 2020, the government put out a fairly detailed document. And one of the indications actually from there was that it was now seeking debt relief and cancellation where possible. Let's start with your overall assessment of the November 2020 economic recovery strategy.
Okay. First, I think the recovery strategy came too late. Because this was close to 8 months after the shock came in. Obviously, so it's basically, well, I think it might have been released with the expectation, or rather with the hopes that, look, we didn't go too deeply down. So this is a recovery document, so that's understandable. But a recovery document of this kind for a government that has no space in the balance sheet to spend any money, crowding new money, obviously is a recovery strategy by name only. I think the most salient part about that recovery strategy is the fact that government admits that, look, we need some kind of debt relief or some kind of debt rearrangement. So it's mostly actually a debt, it's basically about a debt management policy. So how do we manage this debt, and then what else do we choose? The obsession with big spending is still up there. I think one of the things that's lacking that the government has not mentioned is a fiscal consolidation stance. Of course, it's mentioned here and there, but a fiscal consolidation stance about what needs to be done. And I think, in my view, the government of Kenya, and that is all arms, are not entirely, either they're not entirely appraised of, or they think that actually you can weather or kick into the future the problem that needs to be done. There's something really big about the size of the public sector in terms of not numbers, but who's exactly being paid and what's that money being spent on. Now, without structuring that part, I think there's going to be a problem.
Let me come back to the subject of fiscal consolidation, and I don't hold brief for the government, but I can tell you the talk around the situation we are in. We are in unusual circumstances, and for a moment we can give ourselves some breathing space from the fiscal consolidation agenda, effectively to spend our way out of this crisis. How do you respond to that, Kwame?
Well, the government of Kenya spends a lot of money, to be honest. So one of the ways in which I think that fiscal consolidation seems not to, because I'm not too sure that the money is going to priority areas. So if you see, whether you're in Nairobi or other places, the government of Kenya is still spraying a lot of infrastructure projects, keeping infrastructure projects going. Whether that was intended to be part of the fiscal stimulus, and I think, yes, there's an argument that some of it would be a different one. But because, these are big capital projects. So in my view, those are the ones that actually could have been suspended for a while to buy that fiscal space by spending in other places. So that's a problem. Counties, governments, which also ensure that if you're talking about some fiscal surge, obviously county spending at the local government levels would be useful. Some counties are unable to pay their workers. They have arrears for workers of 2 months. So for as long as that's not happening, I'm not too sure that the right projects have been chosen. Because a fiscal stimulus, even if it's understandable, and some people question it, even if it's understandable, depends on where you push the money in quickly, into people's hands, into the hands of private sector to actually spend.
If you look at the recently tabled budget policy statement by the National Treasury, if you look at the borrowing plan for the next financial year, just back on the envelope calculation will tell you we are going to knock up our public debt stock to about 8.7 trillion shillings. And one of the key questions I'm asked now is that could we be potentially hitting the ceiling within the next financial year? Does it bother you, Kwame?
Yes, it bothers me, but not in the way that it bothers everybody. I don't know. Our view is that this is our account based on public declared information and looking at some Hansard reports, that in the since the Jubilee administration came in, I think we've had 5 instances, 5 of the debt ceiling, 4 instances, this would be the 5th, of the debt ceiling being raised. So it's telling you that maintaining the debt ceiling or raising it is not effective for managing government's finances. So it's become a ritual. The cabinet secretary comes in, calls on the calls on Parliament, and Parliament makes a few noises in the press, but raises it nevertheless. So I'm not too sure that so it's become a convenient dance between them. So I don't think that having a debt ceiling anymore is a useful way of managing this. But so that's the thing. But I'm definitely bothered. What I'm bothered about is that the declared debt management strategy is this: that the government of Kenya will move debt from shorter term to longer term debt. It's not moving that way fast enough. So what that means is that we are not solving the debt distress problem where you have to, use bonds. Use bills, treasury bills, to pay other treasury bills. Yeah. So basically, you're swapping one kind of paper for the other. That's a big danger, because when you come to a lock where, so for instance, in my calculation based on the data from the treasury, by November last year, 80% of public debt was 5 years or younger. Actually, about 4 years or younger. Now, I don't think that's healthy, especially if government says, on the other hand, that we have longer term bonds and all that. So really, the imperative is actually to strengthen, or rather to lengthen the tenure, in addition to capping expenditure. So Parliament has to be used to the fact that that debt ceiling would be raised. So I don't think that whether you raise it or not raise it in itself matters. What you need to ask is, by raising it, how much space are you buying for stretching the tenure, and therefore buying some space so that you're not spending 900 billion this year. 900 billion paying debt, because as you can tell, the 900 billion is used to 904 billion was expected this year to pay. Of course, it's a little less because of the reschedules. But next year, the debt stock that's due for repayment will be about 900 billion or a trillion as well. Yes. So that's a worrisome bit. So the discourse, and I think Parliament is responsible for it, about managing public debt has come to about whether we will raise the debt ceiling or not. It's inevitable. As you said, by the end of this year, actually, based on what the IMF's advice is, and which government has now conceded, it's prudent advice, that all government undertakings on behalf of public sector firms, even if they're profit making, should actually be on the government's balance sheet. And once you put them on in, then obviously the debt ceiling will be breached, and so it will have to be adjusted.
Okay. Have we done enough to prop up the education sector? And why that question sticks out is because I was told, if you look at the stimulus package for the hospitality industry, we are giving soft loans to private businesses to try and catalyze them. But on the education sector, we are talking about hiring more teachers. Do you feel there's a mismatch in terms of response?
What the pandemic has shown, and which is something government could have done, was the construction of classrooms. Would that have been a stimulus? It would have been, because it provides local area jobs and stuff like that. It would have been, definitely. To decide to construct classrooms to a reasonable standard, using local labor, materials, or at least getting contractors to hire local people. It could have been. It could have worked as a form of stimulus. So that's basically it. Instead, government has opted to go for capital-intensive industries, basically. And of course, I know tourism and hospitality employs many more people, but it's also very capital-intensive because you're maintaining very huge stock of labor and stock of infrastructure and material. So that's it. So yes, the choices, I don't think so. There could have been an opportunity to use school construction or infrastructure in public education facilities, because it's the biggest footprint that government of Kenya has. There are close to more than 30,000 schools in the public owned by government in one way, primary and secondary schools. It's a huge way to have started. So I think that's obviously not.
There's a lot of concern out here, Kwame, as we wrap up, around the manufacturing sector. And why that is the case is because in the last financial year, there used to be an electricity rebate. It was withdrawn. Yeah. We have now come up with minimum tax, which even loss-making companies will be remitting 1% of their turnover. And the worry is what is left of manufacturing, and why that is important is because manufacturing tends to be labor-intensive. So if you're talking about creating jobs, that would be the first place you're looking at. But many stakeholders in the sector will tell you they don't think they're on the top priority of the government. Do you share this view?
I have mixed views about it. The first is true, not only because manufacturing is so important for Kenya's structural transformation. I think one of the things Kenya needs to do is get a few more people off agriculture, jobs rather, from people who are doing subsistence agriculture into some kind of manufacturing. That kind of structural transformation that's where Kenya is stuck, and it needs to be made. But also because the Big Four recognize, the Big Four agenda by the President of the Jubilee administration recognizes that manufacturing had been stunted, but not only stunted, was actually shrinking. So Kenya was undergoing premature deindustrialization. So at the time President Moi was leaving, and in the first few years of President Kibaki's administration, manufacturing was close to 11, 12, I think in some year even 13% of gross domestic product. At the time, at the peak of the Jubilee administration, at the end of the of the first administration, term, it was back to 7 and 8. And right now it's about 8 or 8. So obviously something needs to be done. Well, the economy has grown as well, so it's a bigger sum, but basically that kind of shrinkage does not show good prospects for Kenya's productivity growth and development in general. So obviously it's something that needs to be resolved. And that's what tells us at the Institute of Economic Affairs that by shifting, simply cutting the costs of power here, reducing one tax there, is not. It's a structural problem that government needs to solve together with it. And what that means is new manufacturing firms need to come in. My fear about the way we look at manufacturing is we look at manufacturing as if we need to defend existing manufacturing firms, especially those owned by government. We are talking the sugar farms, the cement farms, most of which are actually burning value. So you give them 60 billion shillings and then you have to give them another 60 billion shillings after 8 years. So you're actually destroying value. When the truth is, government should actually ask ourselves, how many of these farms have such low productivity or negative productivity that they need to be cut out? So what government needs to foster is new competition for manufacturing firms to go up the value chain, but also to increase their productivity. So the third point that we disagree with is there's a thinking that the way to make manufacturing actually thrive in Kenya is to actually go back into. Government has invested in textile farms, many of which couldn't compete, and that's why part of the reason they've closed. I don't think their prospects are good just because government is pushing money, because if they were, Kenya's private sector would have gone into those farms to begin with. But people will enjoy that because if you give them protection so that they can sell expensive goods and not have to compete with Chinese or Thai or Vietnamese fabrics, for instance, then they might. But that'll just give them respite for a while. If you think about what the Africa Continental Free Trade Area does, it's a good opportunity for Kenya's manufacturing to step out. But I don't think the pressure is that way. So the minimum tax is definitely a bad thing. But just removing it alone would ease some pressure for farms. But what we need to ask ourselves, are new farms coming in? And believe it or not, I mean, this is sad, are old, ineffective, inefficient farms that are making money nevertheless being wiped out, because some of them would need to be retooled or actually wiped out.
Right, and that point by Kwame Owino takes us to the close of our conversation on Business Redefined. Up next is the Markets Report.